if he doesn't set out a timeline for 2.5% of GDP, which is the least we should be spending given the rising threats from Russia, China, the Pacific, the Middle East, Iran, then he will leave us unprepared and our men and women of our armed forces unprotected. The last time that happened was the snatched Land Rover scandal, which we all sadly remember in Afghanistan, which was also under the Labour government, where troops were sent in with the wrong kit. He's been warned. He's been warned by his own party and his own backbenchers who support defence. He's been warned by this government and the last government that they need to start spending on it and just change priorities of government. That's what you have to do to lead us to choose. So if he doesn't, he will put at risk tens of thousands of British jobs, and he'll also put at risk the safety and security of this country.
Times reports on fears by defence officials that the government will cut spending on major military projects in the autumn budget. That would be despite increasing pressure from chiefs and allies to spend more. One source raised concerns over the ambition to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP and that it wouldn't be achieved until well beyond 2030. Well, let's speak to the former Conservative MP and former Defence Secretary Sir Ben Wallace. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How concerned are you by these reports?
Well, I think it's a concern because we've seen it all before, insofar as the behaviour of the Treasury to seek short-term decisions on a department that functions really in long-term planning. And very, very many times we have seen cost increases or black holes driven by a Treasury's insistence to try and shoehorn things into sort of almost annual cycles. And this will be the test of both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor and indeed the new Defence Secretary, because the real test here is the Prime Minister came in saying my first duty was to defence. Well, let's see if that translates into priorities, because the MOD needs to deliver against the threat. It does so over a 10 and 20-year horizon. It doesn't do it in neat little blocks of 1 year. And if the Treasury is any good, it should be allowing like a 10-year budget, as other countries do, and flexibility within that budget. That way you will get more for less. But I fear Rachel Reeves, who's very much a creature of the Treasury, an official machine, will produce the usual pressures that in the end we will all pay for in the long term.
But isn't it just building on what you did as Defence Secretary? On your watch, you backed plans to cut troop numbers to their smallest in history. Aren't they just building on what you did before them?
Well, no. First of all, under me, I was the first to balance my budget 3 times in a row since the Second World War, and I don't think it's been done since or before.
But you cut troop numbers, didn't you?
Yeah, but I then increased other capabilities. It's not like we've been cutting troop numbers since the First World War, at least, because the main aim of our military is to be lethal. And by the way, if you reduce this to a troop number debate, you will in fact prepare yourself for the wrong type of war. This is not like, Bobby's on the beat. This is one of the problems with government overall, is that we reduce it to banal slogans rather than actually understanding what we need. The job of the military is to defend the nation and to deliver lethality to Britain's enemies and her allies' enemies. That's the job. So, for example, the modern 155 long-range artillery mobile platform, either as a Boxer or an Archer from Sweden, it has a crew of 2. The AS-90, Britain's version, which is coming out of service, has a crew of 5. The new platforms are more lethal, longer range, and quicker firing rate. Does that mean we have to have a crew of 5 just because we used to have a crew of 5? So I think the challenge here is really what is going to happen in the short term. So when I took over in defence, we had to find £2 to £3 billion in pressure. I took intelligence to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson at the time, showed him what I was worried about. We had a discussion in Number 10, and we got the money. We didn't get everything, but we got over £2 billion in order to prepare the way for the then comprehensive spending review, which gave us another 24 billion. So that's the test. The test here for this new government is, yes, you've got pressures. They're not a surprise, as I keep seeing in every Labour press release, that, oh my God, it was worse than we thought. You only have to look at the National Audit Office report of 2023 in December. The public, your listeners can go online and look at it there. It shows you the pressures. Some of the pressures in defence have been as a result of inflation. And this is my point about short term versus long term. our planning, our equipment programs in defense can be 10 years, 20 years long. The aircraft carrier was a 20-year project. So inflation, obviously, which is much higher than when we originally planned this, now accounts for an extra £10 billion over the next 10 years. So those sort of things need to be met. If we have effectively rather wild, short notice pay settlements, as we saw within weeks of this new Labour government, that has to be found within the budget. So I think here the test is, will John Healey go to Rachel Reeves and the Prime Minister, and will the Prime Minister match his statement that defence is his first duty with a funding amount to relieve the short-term pressures to avoid long-term cost increase, or will he not? And I think that's where we'll find out what he really means on defence. And if we don't, if we scrap GCAP, that's Britain, Italy, and Japan's next generation of fighter, we will potentially put at risk 60,000 jobs across the whole of the United Kingdom. Because when Typhoon finishes, we'll just be buying American, and there will be no jobs and no missiles made in Stevenage and Bolton and all the other ancillaries that go with it, and servicing in Lincoln and all those bases. And there'll be no jobs in Lancashire, and we'll lose jobs elsewhere in the system, including the West Country. So that's the question. And I remember in week one, the Ministry of the Armed Forces talked about buying British. Well, let's see.
Do you think that the plans that we're seeing now from this new Labour government is sufficient to protect us? Or do you think that these plans actually are a threat to national security?
I think if he doesn't set out a timeline for 2.5% of GDP, which is the least we should be spending given the rising threats from Russia, China, the Pacific, the Middle East, Iran, then he will leave us unprepared and our men and women of our armed forces unprotected. The last time that happened was the snatched Land Rover scandal, which we all sadly remember in Afghanistan, which was also under the Labour government, where troops were sent in with the wrong kit. He's been warned. He's been warned by his own party and his own backbenchers who support defence. He's been warned by this government and the last government that they need to start spending on it and just change priorities of government. That's what you have to do to lead us to choose. So if he doesn't, he will put at risk tens of thousands of British jobs, and he'll also put at risk the safety and security of this country.
You talk about changing the priorities of government. The question that many people will be asking as they listen to this conversation is, OK, if there needs to be more money put into the armed forces, where does that come from? Are you talking about cuts from other departments, or are you talking about tax rises? Where's this money going to come from?
Well, I think first and foremost, one of the things that we could do is be more flexible over a 10-year period rather than just in a short 1-year period. So that alone, if the Treasury and Rachel Reeves is prepared to flex the department's budget much greater, e.g. between what we call capital spending and the day-to-day running spending, and she is prepared to give us a 10-year budget, which is exactly what the Gray report recommended under the last Labour government, which was a reform to modernisation, then you will see you get more for less at the very least. And I give you an example. In 2008, the then Labour government aircraft carrier had to be delayed. They put in a deferment because of the budget. That 2-year delay alone, according to the National Audit Office, cost in the region of £500 million, because by that stage, inflation and everything else had got to it. In fact, it cost 600 million. So we can do that, and that will help John Healey make good decisions and the services in the long time, and in the long term, save money, because deferral in capital projects costs. But also across government, yes, if he says defence is his first duty as a Prime Minister, as they all do, I'm afraid to say, then he should be prepared to look at the budgets in things like the health service, or maybe the benefit. The single biggest budget we have in any government is the benefits bill. It's the biggest by a country mile. He could look at that budget. He could look at budgets in other areas, any one of the areas. The energy, he very quickly, Keir Starmer spent a lot of extra money on the so-called energy, GB energy, whatever it was, that's been announced. Well, he could maybe do that in a different way and not spend so much money. And we still don't know how much money has gone to train drivers from the public purse for their record settlement as well.
Do you look back on your time and think, actually, maybe I could have done it differently. Maybe I didn't do my best for the armed forces? Because I'm getting loads of messages coming in here saying, the Tories underfunded defence for years. This is hypocrisy. Do you accept that maybe your role as Defence Secretary, you made mistakes and could have done things differently?
Well, so as me, as the Defence Secretary, when I was steering the ship, I increased defence spending above the budget by 33 billion. Okay, so my predecessors often didn't, but I delivered on my efficiency savings, and I also delivered on a record real increase in defence spending compared to others. Now, people might not like the choices we spent that money on, and there's always that tension between the old and the new. But fundamentally, I also managed to persuade a prime minister to increase funding. I persuaded the very last prime minister to put a date on 2.5% of GDP. And I also put at the centre, I think, of the culture of defence, that defence is a core part of government. It's not some add-on. Now, also, how much you spend on defence is, of course, linked to the threat. And I think, that is important. You don't just spend money when there is no threat, but you do need to make sure as the threat rises, you increase it. And so I absolutely did that. And from my own test, I went across the road to the Treasury and Number 10 and got the money I asked for. I also was honest. So you can, all those listeners texting in, I also said that under both Labour and the Conservative previous governments, defence was hollowed out. Now, Labour try and pretend I don't say the Labour bit, but I was a serving soldier under Labour, and Labour hollowed out defence, as did the Conservatives. Boris Johnson turned it around, and we need to continue that upward tick.
You'll be pleased to know that lots of messages coming in saying that Ben Wallace is a loss to politics. Clearly, you're no longer part of the Conservative Party. Former Conservative MP decided to stand down. Many people had you as a favourite to be leader of the Conservative Party. Have you decided who you think would be the best next leader of the Conservative Party?
Not yet. No. I haven't. I mean, look, I was in opposition. I remember being in Liz Truss's cabinet. I think I was the only member of the cabinet who'd been in opposition. There are different qualities required to be in opposition, but there's also a competition going on. And I think we have some excellent candidates, and they need to set out their stalls. I'll probably make a decision when it comes to the conference period, because I think that's quite important that, the membership and the wider public get to see their pitches in an environment which will showcase it. So I haven't at the moment, but whoever it is, I will look for someone who recognises the threats we face and is prepared to make the tough choices on priorities, because ultimately that is the area that I think governments of all colours have struggled with when it comes to defence. They say they want to lead defence, they want to be in the world, they want to go to wars, and they want to contribute to our security. But when it comes to the tough politics of, do you spend it on health or do you spend it on defence? Do you spend it on education, or they've always just spent it on health, education, and other things. But that didn't used to happen. And, without security and defence, there can be no prosperity and no stable economy. And people should remember that. But I'm afraid the Treasury always views defence as a sort of, an endless pit of just a bit more corporate raiding to pay for something else. And that isn't acceptable. I made that decision. It made me pretty unpopular sometimes amongst the team that is the government. But unless we change the culture and realise we've got to fund our defence, we simply will not get the international influence we need, nor the defence forces we want. It's all very well prime ministers posturing in front of Trooping the Colour and the red arrows saying everything's fine, but it isn't, and it hasn't been for 30 years.
Well, hopefully when you decide who you're going to back for the leadership, you'll come on and tell us. That would be nice.
You'll be bored senseless of everybody.
Never. So Ben Wallace, thank you so much for speaking to us this morning, former Conservative MP and Defence Secretary. Really interesting there, saying that if Keir Starmer doesn't set out a timeline for the 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence, he says he will leave us underprepared and the armed forces unprotected.